Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Girl Women with Lara Rathod. And this is part 2 of our conversation with Sameen Affaf on being 30-something. Welcome back, Sameen.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we were talking in the break about how we've gone most of our lives with not noticing the things around us. And when I say the things, I mean the systems that we are part of. So the systems of patriarchy, the systems of capitalism, the isms, the sort of racism, sexism, Islamophobia, transphobia, misogyny, etc., etc. And what's interesting is that there are things that happen that I think force you to realize it, but sometimes you don't realize it from the first or second or third. Like I think it's something that kind of builds in us. So when did you start to realize that there were these systems that we are all operating in? And when did you sort of start to realize how you fit and how you were affected by them?
Yes, I think it first started with recognizing how I was othered in the greater society. There was that feeling since I was a child. I recognized it because we speak about how these systems, we just mentioned in the break, how they're the water, the cultural water that we find ourselves in, the air around us, and then we realize, like, we don't even understand how we are part of these systems themselves. But I recognized, I think, early on, and again, this is from our socialization at school, who surround us, the books that you read as a child, being able to identify yourself. And so, of course, as like a brown girl and as a Muslim girl, I realized very early on, like, okay, so the norm is very white, right? That was what's considered, those were the faces that you saw.
The archetype of beauty.
The archetype of beauty, exactly. The ways of doing, what was considered to be obviously Western Eurocentric norms were all around me. And then at home, I had this my two Pakistani immigrant parents raising me within that culture, in this greater Western culture that I was surrounding myself in. So I already saw that, okay, at home, things are a certain way, outside things are different. So there was that awareness as a child. And of course, growing up in, the post 9/11 era, that was, I was, I think 13 years old when 9/11 occurred. And, I have always had a very strong Muslim identity, a very strong spiritual identity. Even as a child, that was something that was very strong. I had mentioned to you when I was, I think around the same time, actually, I had decided to wear hijab for a year, just out of this, like, curiosity of, spiritually, I felt like it was right for me, which is so interesting as a child deciding to do that. But I noticed that, okay, the teachers around me who I'd been at I went to a school for the performing arts, which was very different. I think also, yes, for a brown girl was very different as well, because it was a school where we learned music, dance, drama, visual arts. And it was from grade 4 to 8. And so for the first couple of years, we were with the same teachers, the same group of kids going through from each grade. And so these were kids that I had known for a couple of years, teachers that had known me. And then one day after summer vacation, I just showed up with a hijab on. And it was sort of like, oh. Like,
and visually then, it's a very easy way to other somebody, right? Because like, absolutely, without that really defines, like, it's not define, I'm not using it. That really is a visual representation of the fact that you're a Muslim. Whereas if you're just a brown person, if you're a brown person, then you can be ethnically ambiguous, because people don't really know exactly where you're from, or, your beliefs.
Exactly. And exactly. So no one can tell at first glance that I'm Muslim, because I don't have a hijab on today. And also, I carry a certain amount of privilege because of, I do look ethnically ambiguous in comparison to, like, my mother, for example, or in a dark-skinned Black woman who is very identifiable by their race. And so I have to recognize that there's a certain privilege with that, of being able to navigate certain spaces and, you know, people not necessarily knowing who I am or where I come from, which is not the case
with
for
the way
everybody.
you speak and your accent as well.
Right, of course. I
Right.
have this certain, you know, growing up in, you know, in Canada, in Toronto, I obviously learned very quickly how to navigate white spaces as a brown girl. I knew what it took to become accepted and liked. You know, if I spoke a certain way, I act a certain way, what that meant, right? And what sort of doors would open for me, what doors might be closed for me if I didn't.
These are things that as children, it can happen from the most imperceptible thing, from seeing how somebody else that you know might be treated. And it's like, it's not like you consciously go, oh, I don't want to be treated like that. You're just a child, a little sponge soaking up everything, trying to be, right? And so it's just, you kind of end up, I think, growing into what feels safe, where, you know, you won't be singled out and othered.
Exactly. It's a survival mechanism. You realize how to survive in that space. And you're right. I saw how others would treat and sort of look at my mother, you know, as a child. You know, obviously she spoke with an accent. English was not her first language. You know, she had recently immigrated with me as a child. And so she had to navigate, you know, a completely different culture that was very different to her own. And so seeing how others treated her, seeing how, and bless her, she has always been like this fearless, very like, you know, it never mattered to her. I never saw her struggle with trying to look for the approval of, you know, of the people around her. But I saw the very, you know, small sort of ways that people would look at her or speak to her. And I internalized that. And then so I thought, okay, you know, I have to do things a certain way in order to not be seen how she's seen, because she's seen as other and I don't want to be othered. Nobody wants to be othered. And
also from like being from an immigrant family, right? Survivalist. It's like I think that they want their children to assimilate and not face the struggles that they may have faced.
Absolutely. There's a tension between holding on to your cultural and religious identity in a very different space. So there's a tension of like, I want you to hold on to this, but yet I want you to be able to survive in this space. And so, of course, growing up, there's that tension of walking between, or at least what I saw then as a tension of dealing with these seemingly dual aspects of my identity of like home and outside of the home. And so when I decided to wear the hijab for that 1 year of school, I really saw that, okay, my teachers who have known me this time are treating me differently. You know, my friends are looking at me differently. And of course I was the same person, but it's amazing how that one piece of cloth changed and defined me in a way that was also out of my control, because of course, along with that visual representation came a whole onslaught of assumptions that were not defined by me, right? Which were defined by the society that I live in. And so in that year, I saw my parents really worry, and like my aunts and uncles worry about like, okay, like maybe you're too young to wear the hijab. Maybe, maybe decide when you're older if you'd like to wear it. What will others think of you? Like they're actually worried, like, and this is funny where we think of our own internalized oppression, but worried about like, oh, what if she's becoming like too conservative and too, there was this association of the hijab with like conservatism, which I didn't even see myself as this kid. For me, it was like, this is just an expression of who I am and my identity. It was my relationship with a higher power. I just felt like it was me at that time. And so, of course, listening to their worries, I decided not to wear it. And today, if you were to ask me, I still sometimes feel, actually more recently than ever, this need to show up fearlessly. And so I toy with the idea of sometimes, especially as I talk about decolonization, as I talk about the need for Black, Indigenous, people of color to show up in their full power and not be afraid of that white gaze, and so I've wrestled with that. But Yeah, I was very aware. And so it changed though, of course, and we can go into this if you want to, in terms of how that led to what I studied and, you know, my career choice and where I am today.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to go on to that. But before we do, can you just tell me, what do you think are some of the most misunderstood things about your religion?
Oh, of course. So of course there's this need, especially from the Western media, and you know that the media serves a very political objective, and a very Western imperialist objective to vilify and demonize Muslims and Islam as the other. That it's so. Of course, the biggest misconception is that it's inherently violent and promotes violence. So that would be number one, right? And of course, you know, if we were to do a word association with the general public, it's like Muslim word association, terrorist, because we've been so indoctrinated to believe that those are one and the same, right? So immediately when you think terrorist, you think Muslim, because that's the imagery that we've been shown, when of course, like my faith is completely antithetical to violence of any nature. And it's all rooted in this actual deep wanting to abolish oppression. It's all about justice and seeking justice. And that actually has been the driving spiritual force behind my work when it comes to racial justice and anti-oppression, anti-imperialism. So that, of course, is the biggest misconception. And I think it feeds into this idea of Muslims being a threat, of Muslims being completely backward and uncivilized. And so, you know, you will hear even from like white feminists, this idea that like Muslim women are completely devoid, they have no rights, they're subjugated, that they are completely at the hands of, you know, of the men in their lives, that, you know, they completely have no freedom, no liberation. When again, as a Muslim woman, I can absolutely tell you that my Islam, what Islam is about the liberation of women, of ensuring women's rights. You know, especially if we're talking about the inception of Islam at a time where women had no rights, you know, and Islam was like, you know, the first to grant those rights. So for me, this is my liberation. And so when I see, you know, these misconceptions, I felt a very strong.
It's deeply hurtful. Like
it's of course deeply
and it's
hurtful.
Exhausting, right?
Exhausting. And so, you know, I felt a strong need. I had mentioned to you in our pre-call, when I was a kid in school, I wrote this, you know, article for the school newspaper that was entitled like, I'm Muslim, I'm not a terrorist, you know, and that was me as a kid, like writing this article, begging people to see me as I am. And that even showed up in terms of like, you know, after graduate school, when I was invited to speak on a panel. This is funny now because I identify as a radical. Again, I'm Muslim and I'm a radical in the best sense of the word, you know, in terms of seeking justice. You hear radical Muslim, and of course that's something nobody wants to hear. But you know, I was invited to this panel that was about preventing youth radicalization. That was the topic of the panel. And I felt like I was asked, and also asked to be there as a Muslim, but also that I had to show up there in defense of my entire faith, in defense of the Muslim community. And, you know, I have always felt that, even as a child, that I am consistently showing you that I am not this. I am not a terrorist. I'm not anything that you believe that I am. And now in my adult life, I recognize like, I don't want to show up in defense of what I'm not anymore. I just want to be who I am.
Because when you're putting all of your energy into having to defend your very existence or your right to be or your inherent worthiness. It's not only is it exhausting, but it then drains you of that same energy, which we ended part one with, talking about how, you know, we have a finite amount of energy. And so it drains you of the energy that you can be putting into creativity and justice and using your voice to create meaningful change. And I think that obviously in these systems, exhausting people and overwhelming people is a tool that is used. Right?
It's the objective. it's the objective and the goal. And so for me, recognizing that, and mind you, it's taken a very long time to get to that point of recognizing that this is a tactic of depletion and distraction. And, you know, away from building the world and contributing to the world that I want to see and that I know is possible. And so that is where my attention goes these days. Of like, I don't need to show up in defense of what I'm not. I don't need to convince, you know, whiteness and the patriarchy and anything else of what I am. I can do that by just being in my full power. And
because then that benefits, it benefits you, but also you showing up in this way does a few things. It gives people permission when they see you to also show up. It's an inspiration for people, but also, you know, by showing up in your life and living your life and using your voice in this way, you are then using your life and yourself as a class, right? Like, it's
I hope so, yes.
I firmly believe that. You inspired me. And in fact, you were the first person to recognize, I think we connected at a time that I had shared my Corona Diaries video 100 on women, what happens when women speak up. You know, we have to look at how they're treated. And also, I'd done a post on racism about, you know, Prince William and Sharon Osbourne and this whole, and Piers Morgan, this whole dance of, they're not a racist, we're not a racist. And you said to me, you used the term emotional labor. And you said, like, it takes a lot of emotional labor to be producing content like this, and you need to also look after yourself. And I haven't forgotten that, because it does take a lot of emotional labor to show up and to just live and to be. And in the UK, we're still singing the song of, you know, he and she is not a racist. We spend more time debating about the fact that somebody has been called a racist, making it part of their identity, and because that identity doesn't fit with they've done this nice thing or that nice thing, rather than, you know, for me, like, when you're calling somebody a racist, I actually focus on the behavior. So I call the behavior racist, right? Because I think that that's more correct. It's the behavior in any given moment. What is your behavior going to be? What you claim to be and what the labels are, that doesn't determine anything. It's about the behavior and who you align with and who you know, kind of support. It's your behavior. You're making a choice, and from that choice we can draw a conclusion on the behavior rather than like the identity, because we all have racism. I mean, and that's the other point, right? Yes. Growing up in these systems, the patriarchy, we all have, you know, internalized misogyny, we have internalized racism. Those things touch us regardless of the color of our skin. You know, brown and black people, you know, they have issues with colorism, you know, like we all have these things inside us. And so we all have to excavate and examine our biases and do the hard work of wrestling. Where does this belief come from? Well, first being able to see our reaction, our unconscious reaction inside, and then figure out, where does that come from? And is this who I want to be? And if it's not who I want to be, what am I going to do actively? Because things don't happen magically. You don't wake up one day and suddenly you're free of all your biases.
Oh no. And that's the thing, right? Especially in this very capitalist society where we're looking for quick fixes to things, right? Quick fixes to healing always. And
the box.
Check the box. And this is not that type of work, right? And one thing to realize is that, as you mentioned, yes, so we live in an inherently racist system and culture of which we are a part. So we have internalized, you know, that deeply embedded racism. So the argument of, you know, who is racist, who is not racist, is sort of null and void then, right?
We're all racist.
We're all complicit. Yes. And so, and also recognizing that, you know, this is so much more than a self-improvement exercise, right? Which I think so much of what anti-racism work has focused on is on those feelings, right? Rather than the behavior. And okay, it's all well and good to do that, but recognizing that the systems themselves, beyond just you as an individual, we're talking about institutionalized racism, right? Which has led to the murders of, you know, African people, that has led to the incarceration of, Black and Indigenous populations and brown folks here in the US. This is not just about feelings. It's about really deeply embedded, institutionalized racism and patriarchy as well, which we know is the case. And so it's so much more than just the feelings. And that's why I think it's so important for us. This is the education we will never receive in schools. This is not.
In fact, they're actively trying to make us not receive it, because there's a huge whitewashing of education and history.
Absolutely. And of course, with intention, and that's intentional, it's purposeful, because, this system profits and gives power to a certain few. And that is thought to be maintained by our school systems to, of course, and it continues that oppression of, Black and Indigenous and people of color everywhere. And so being able to really self-educate and seek out educational tools in order to learn about that institutionalized racism, patriarchy, capitalism, and imperialism is so important in recognizing just what is maintaining these systems. And of course, that's a huge discussion that I know it requires a lesson in itself. And again, it's not an overnight lesson to be learned.
I mean, you've been doing a lot of self-directed learning, and of course you did your master's and you were teaching, as well with that too. Can you, for somebody that is starting out, that's curious, because I think that, it's the people who are curious that will then decide, oh, I want to find out a little bit more. So can you maybe signpost a couple of, I don't know, either books or podcasts or any tools that somebody can start their journey, and then if they are interested, but pre-framing, I want to say that, you don't have to be so wholly educated to be anti-racist. You can do things in conjunction, because being anti-racist is calling out behavior in the moment. And then there's learning, so that you start to understand and uncover. And those two things can happen at the same time.
Yes. And I think that's the key there too, is that especially after the murder of George Floyd, we saw this influx, like we mentioned in part one, of anti-racist literature, books, platforms online. The information is available to you at your fingertips if you seek it out. And of course, being very critical of that information. So I'd make sure, again, don't follow the people with the biggest following necessarily, but seek out, of course, resources that are from Black. I would say that directly is, Black educators primarily, other people of color, other Indigenous folks who are doing this work on the ground. That is the entry point. You will find, the basics of, what racism is, how it is apparent in our society, how it affects racialized people. That information is there. I think it's so important to go that extra step and read texts that were written by revolutionaries, especially within the US. So, the autobiography of Malcolm X, read, texts by, African revolutionaries from
James
the actual.
Baldwin.
Oh, James Baldwin is great. James Baldwin, I would definitely, Angela Davis, to learn more about, the carceral system. I think that's so important to recognize how, our prison system and our prison industrial complex is just a new form of slavery operating in the US. It is, without question. And so the resources are there. I would say definitely, though, go to Black activists. Don't ask them for their labor necessarily online. Please don't do that. The resources are there and available to you. But it's really about making those connections. And it takes time. It takes time. Yeah. I have been learning about this. Like I said, my education was rooted in this. So yes, I always had the interest as a child, but I've had my entire educational career. And even after that, like I said, I didn't learn about capitalism in school. I studied the prison system, but did I ever talk about abolishing the prison system and what that would look like, what that would mean? Absolutely not. Did we talk about how these lands, especially in the US and Canadian context, were colonized, and the indigenous people that land belonged to, what was done to them. And now that's coming up. I don't know if your viewers have been listening and following about the residential schools and what's been happening, and following the discovery of these mass graves of children. It's devastating. So learn about the history. The history is so important. We can't know where we're going if we don't know how we got here. Learn about the history, not from a Eurocentric perspective, from a white perspective, because that's what we were already taught in schools. We need to learn about that history from the perspective of, Black, Indigenous folks, from people of color, of histories outside of our borders, recognizing how our fate here is tied to the fate of others in other parts of the world. It's like a big puzzle, and it's fitting it together, all the pieces. But once you see how the pieces fit together, you can't unsee it. And
I literally have said those very words.
You can't. And the truth of what this is there. The truth of these systems of oppression, how they function, is there. But make sure you're, of course, seeking out reliable sources. And that's very difficult to do in this age of misinformation, and also in the age of trying to suppress, just like here in the US, there's this whole push against critical race theory in schools and learning about.
I mean, it's just when they're giving it a label, critical race theory, it's actually just history. The reality of what actually happened. There's a lot of ducking and diving of trying to make something what it's not.
And always asking why that is, I think, is very important.
And understanding that as you start seeing things that you can't unsee, there are feelings that will come up. I myself, once I started really seeing things, I started looking back on experiences that I'd had, and I experienced a lot of grief for the times that I hadn't called things out, because the analogy that I've used is that there's like a puppy with an electric fence, that invisible electric fence, and the puppy's like running up, and then it gets zapped. And it's like, nobody ever told me, oh, don't call out racist behavior or whatever. But you absorb it. Don't rock the boat. Oh, you won't be supported if you say it. Nobody will stand up with you. Oh my God, your life could be made harder. And so that silenced me. And so I had to really wrestle, and I'm still wrestling with a lot of grief of all of the times that I didn't speak up and use my voice. And also the uncomfortable feelings of where maybe I had been complacent in my privilege, because we all we all have privilege in different areas. You and I have privilege with the way we speak. If we weren't, if we were like phoning somebody, nobody would know that you and I were brown. And we'll get better treatment from that, right? So but then in another context, we're not going to have the same amount of privilege. So it's sort of wrestling with all of those competing ideas. And I think part of becoming an adult is like learning to accept two truths, or hold multiple truths at the same time, and be okay with being a work in progress and a masterpiece, and being growing but also grounded. And
yes, absolutely that. And actually, as you asked previously, where do you start? And truly you start with yourself, right? And recognizing, who am I, what privileges and what power do I have and hold in society? And we were very honest about that. You're honest about, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of ability, physical ability, in terms of where you come from, wealth, all of these privileges that give you power, and of course with that power over others, and what does that mean in terms of your responsibility, in terms of your role and how we seek justice for others. But it's truly being honest with yourself about that. And a lot of people have a lot of trouble with being honest, that you have power over others.
And privilege, like at the Women's March, somebody held a sign and it said, privilege is when you think something's not a problem because it's not a problem for you personally.
Exactly.
That landed with me in a big way. I don't think I'd ever realized obviously I knew the word privilege, but I don't think
Yeah.
I'd ever realized that that's really what it meant, that you could have a different life experience and you think something's not a problem. Like I've never been, for example, stopped in a store or followed in a store. That's never happened to me. So from my perspective, if I didn't know that it's happened to other people, I would think, no, that doesn't happen, because my experience of it is it doesn't happen. And so that's where like being open and curious and willing, it all comes from a desire to recognize what is and then figure out who you want to be in the what isness.
Yes, absolutely. So, and sorry, and just recognizing that our experiences are so varied, but really understanding, it's about listening to stories, listening to what people are saying, and you know, for example, and believing them, whether it's women, whether it's Black women, you know, specifically. And we've heard the stories. And so this has been like a year and a half of listening, of seeing, and it really comes down to the point of how much do we need to know in order to actually mobilize ourselves towards change, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very key. You can get stuck into this stage of, you know,
I'm still educating. I don't know anything. And it's like, this is about being human.
Exactly. And you can get stuck in that, and that can become a way of absolving yourself. Like, oh, I'm just still educating myself. I'm not ready to take a change. But there comes a point where we know, you know, that, for example, Black Americans in the US are targeted by the criminal justice system. We know this. We've known this for a very long time. And so we don't need to know more. You know, we need to act. So I just wanted to make that caveat very clear.
It's totally true. And I guess it also ties into the ethos that you carried when you taught. I'm conscious of time and I know that you need to go. So I'll just quickly touch on this because I want to ask you my last question. But one of the important things that you had said to me when you were a teacher is that you weren't just a teacher, you were a learner as well. Absolutely. And that seems to be something that you have carried throughout your life, not just in the job that you did, but it's that recognition, right? That I'm learning too, and I can learn from anybody.
Yes. And that was especially important for me as a teacher. You know, I became a teacher after what I had learned about these systems of oppression. It was very important to me that I recognize that education can be a tool that oppresses us when we don't have the education that we need. And it can also be, you know, our tool for emancipation and the key that we need to really liberate ourselves. And so for me, you know, I became a teacher, a high school teacher at that, because I recognized, you know, if I'm able to at least teach these students, especially Black, Indigenous students of color, about what these systems are about, their place in it, give them the critical literacies to be able to navigate these systems. That was very important to me. And of course, there's always this assumption that a teacher comes into a space and is the one that's giving information, and you know, students are just receiving. And for me, you know, that just enforced this hierarchical like division of, you know, power in that space. And it was so important to me that I recognized, like, no, you know, especially with students of color, you know, who come from, who already feel like what they know is devalued and their experiences aren't legitimized or recognized in that space. It was so important to recognize, yes, your experiential knowledge is something. I can learn from you. And so just being, you know, this idea of I am not here to, you know, they say, what's that saying? A good teacher doesn't tell you what to think, but how to think, right? And just being, you know, this idea of we co-create in that space. We learn together. We learn from each other. And, you know, there's this very Eurocentric idea that age is somehow a marker of knowledge and, you know, the wisdom that you have to impart, as if children can't teach us, you know. There's this idea that you have to, again, there's a certain body and a certain person that knows and those who do not. And that, of course, carries on lines of race and everything else. And so in that space, it's just so important to me. You know, I'm not the jug that's filling the little cups with water. We are watering one another. We're growing together. And I know it's very cliche to say, but I can't tell you how much I learned from my students, you know, and learned with them. And so,
and also, like, you were an amazing leader, because you created an environment that where you learned, so you recognize the inherent value in the children that you were teaching, but also you created safety to be able to express and share and use your voice, which nicely brings me to my last question for you, which is, what does using your voice mean to you, and why did you want to be part of this series?
Oh my goodness. Well, first, being part of this series that you've created, Lara, so beautifully, of just bringing together, you know, women from every end of the spectrum, you know, in terms of intersectionality. This was just so important to really get that broad spectrum of experiences and narratives and stories to share. And that says something about the fullness of, you know, our community and what we as women have to offer. So that was very important to me. And I really believe in the power of story. But using your voice, you know, we talked about this, how every woman has a voice, right? And it's about, to me, it's about silencing, you know, the doubt, the other voices that we're subjected to on a daily basis, and really showing up in the fullness, in the genuine authenticity of who we are, without doubt, without reservation, without this fear, you know, and just showing up in love for one another, love for ourselves, and understanding that we are, you know, we have this divine right, this divine voice that has been given to us to be part of the communities that we're in. And it's so necessary, especially as women, you know, there's so much power in that. And that's why it's been suppressed for so long. So us claiming that, reclaiming that, remembering who we are, remembering what our divine power is, that it's our birthright. That's everything. That's everything.
That is the most beautiful way to end.
Oh, I'm so glad.
It is everything. I want to thank you for this incredibly beautiful, inspiring conversation. We noticed this about us in the pre-call, that with us, conversation is very much like a dance.
Oh, and we could go on forever.
I know. We could do a part 3, 4, 5, but I know you need to go. So I just want to take this moment to thank you so very much for sharing all of your wisdom and your insight and your truth and your learnings with us.
That's incredibly humbling, Lara, because the feeling is so mutual, and we've learned so much from each other. And I'm just so grateful just to have this time with you. It has been so lovely.
Thank you so much, Sameen. Thank you for dancing with me today.
Oh, thank you. Anytime.
Okay, everybody. Well, that brings part 2 to a close, and we will see you in the next episode. Bye.